What kind of risk factors can lead to adverse effects in meditation? How to tell the difference between a healthy and dysfunctional meditation group? What is a snakeskin principle? And what is a person-centered approach to meditation? My name is Ari-Pekka, and this is the Laboratory of Mind podcast.
There's another, Cheetah House is having a training actually, but I'm not running it, so I can kind of show up whenever. So as much time as you need.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Okay, so let's start then. So welcome to the Laboratory of Mind podcast. My guest today is Dr. Willoughby Britton, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and a researcher specializing in the research of effects of meditation, especially these adverse effects that we might have. Welcome, Willoughby.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's very nice to have you in this podcast. I just mentioned briefly that I've reviewed some of your research findings and also used those in my latest book on mindfulness and compassion. First of all, could you say something about how you became interested in the meditation? What's your own background in meditation?
So my origin story?
Okay, yeah.
My origin story is like a lot of people's, in that I had kind of a life crisis that propelled me into needing help. A friend, when I was in college, an old friend from childhood committed suicide. And so I was devastated and really discombobulated and really had never had anything like that happen to me before. And I really didn't want to take medication at that stage. I was only 20. And so my dad gave me the book A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield. And that was my gateway drug. And I started, reading that and carrying it around with me everywhere, and it really became my kind of Bible for maybe even as long as a decade after that. So that was how I started. Yeah, that's kind of the short story.
Yeah. So you said that you had that book and practice for decades. How did you find the practice? Did it help you with your things and goals?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the first half of the book is just a kind of basics around navigating the mind. And I think that for any beginner meditator who's never really spent a lot of time watching their minds, there's a lot to learn and a lot to know about how your mind works and how to work with it. Piece is, I think essential for, it should be basic training for anybody. Should be able to know how, what are thoughts, how do they work, how are they linked with emotions, how does that interact with body sensations, what are my own patterns, what are my signals that I'm kind of getting a little bit too activated or too underactivated, how does that look for me? Just spending a little bit more time, getting to know myself.
So were you also involved in some meditation groups, or did you do it just by yourself?
I think that at the beginning, I read a lot of books. I mean, I think in general, books have been kind of, here's my, those are I'm showing him a picture of all my books. Yeah. Books are kind of they're like friends, they're like people that are inside those books talking to you. So that's, books have always been a big thing, but, I started listening, and this is before podcasts and were a thing, right? So I started listening to cassette tapes. Remember those cassette tapes? that taste with like Pema Chodron and that kind of thing. So, I did a lot of kind of independent study, but I did go on retreats with different teachers. I was a member of a sangha in Tucson, which is where I went to graduate school. That the main teacher of that particular sangha was Shinzen Young. So, loosely, and I did a lot of training in like Theravada kind of oriented. I played around with Tibetan Buddhism and other teachers that would come through.
Yeah. So were your practices mainly like a sitting meditation, or also this kind of a bodily practices like yoga or qigong or something like that?
What was my practice?
Yeah. Did you have also like a bodied practices, or mainly sitting meditation?
I mean, I started practicing like more than 25 years ago. So I've done a little bit of everything, and I've gone through phases of different things. So, I mean, I'll also mention that in graduate school, I trained to become a MBSR instructor. And then I also trained to become a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy instructor. So those also kind of became my kind of lineage in my sangha in some way, even though I was also practicing some of the other traditions. That was also a group or a meditation kind of tradition, which was very informative to how I was practicing. So they do a lot of focus on breath awareness. So I would say that was probably my main practice for the first like 10 years, 12 years was mostly breath awareness. Then, yeah, I did a lot of, I would say, this is like a very rough overview of my entire life. You're asking for me to remember like decades of time. There was definitely kind of a breakthrough that I had at one point, which I think a lot of people have, which is, the breakthrough between, like, they say that the wings of the Dharma, like, they fly on, wisdom and compassion. And I think that there can be a tendency for certain types of people to be kind of wisdom junkies and not, and you kind of end up flying like with one wing. So I kind of had that experience where I was like, so much of my practice was so heavily weighted towards like insight, and there wasn't a lot of like heart qualities. There wasn't a lot of joy. There wasn't a lot of compassion. There wasn't like any kind of like juice,
Yeah.
And so I think there was a long period of time where I kind of switched over to more heart practices. And I think around the same time, I started getting more interested in, Tibetan practices and practices that have practices and traditions that have more of a life affirming kind of orientation than the sort of life denying version of Buddhism. Like there's a lot of versions of Buddhism, and one of them is like life is a curse, and the entire point of being here as a human is to like not be reborn. That was the tradition that I was, my kind of my default tradition. And I think that after a while I was thinking maybe like that wasn't a great fit for me, that maybe that there were other ones. And also the tradition that I was trained in was more like, there is no ground. Like if you try to find ground, then you're just a you're just a Hindu trying to find, pretending to be a Buddhist. But there are other versions of Buddhism where, there is a ground, and that is your true nature. And there is a place to land, and there is something to kind of take refuge in. And I think that's a little bit more, I don't know, a little softer landing. So I ended up kind of migrating. Again, this is like a 30-year trajectory.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. And I can actually see many similarities with my own history also with meditation. And you mentioned about these traditions that are mostly about this kind of, I would call those like a pure world where you kind of get rid of these things that are not considered as pure, like these tantric practices where you are actually more involved in what is happening in your kind of ordinary life and experience. Yeah, so you have quite a long history with meditation, and what was the reason that you kind of turned your research into these adverse effects of meditation? Does that history come from your experiences from practicing these traditions or some other researches?
I mean, I think that has a couple different tributaries, the contributors. The first sort of indication that there was something worth pursuing or studying was actually my dissertation study. So up until that point, I started meditating in 1995. I went to graduate school in 2000. I did my first study ever on the neural correlates of near-death experiences. And then I went into studying meditation and did a randomized clinical trial looking at how meditation, in this case, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, so MBCT training, affected sleep as measured by brainwaves. At that point, 5 years into my practice, I was like in what they call the bright faith phase, where, kind of an evangelist, so pretty all promotional, hypothesized that meditation was going to improve sleep and that would be the way that it would improve depression, because sleep and depression are quite linked. And spent hundreds of nights watching people sleep because it's a sleep lab. And when I got all the data in, we basically found the complete opposite of what we hypothesized, and that the meditation group, no matter how you measured the sleep, whether you're looking at, the amount of fast wave activity, the amount of slow wave activity, the number of awakenings, the number of micro arousals, the meditation group's brains were more awake, more aroused. And there was a direct, correlation between how much they were practicing. So it was very much kind of hard to get around that that's what we found. But I was still kind of in denial about it. And so I didn't publish it. I eventually did. But for a while, I sat on the data thinking this is not going to help, promote this practice. And at the time I was at a meditation retreat, and I sort of mentioned to the teacher that what my data said. And she said, I don't know why all you clinical psychologists are trying to make meditation into a relaxation technique. Everyone knows if you meditate enough, you stop sleeping. So I thought, that's a little shocking. And so that led me to two other questions, which is one, what other assumptions are we making as, healthcare providers who are trained in more clinical Western medicine? And we haven't really done our homework in terms of history about Buddhism or how it's been translated into the West. Really hadn't done a lot of that work. So that was one piece. And then the other piece was clearly meditation teachers, especially ones who have been, around for decades running retreat centers, have a lot of knowledge that that they're not telling us, and that they need, that researchers would be good to just ask them what kinds of things have you seen? And that's basically became the beginning of the varieties of contemplative experience study, was just simply to ask meditation teachers, what types of things have you seen? How do you interpret them? And what do you do about it? There was one other, after I finished my dissertation study, I did my residency at Brown University Medical School. The residency is in an inpatient psychiatric hospital. That's where the department is. So during that 1 year, there were 2 meditators who came off 10-day retreats and were psychotic and put in the hospital. And so I went back to the same teacher who's fairly local and said, oh, have you ever seen that before? And it was very clear that this was also a very well-known phenomenon. And so I thought, 10 years into my practice, how do I not know about this? And I'm also a meditation researcher, like going around saying there are no adverse effects. This is much safer than, medications. And yet we haven't really been asking the right questions. And so that conversation was like practically the first interview. It was like, okay, like, so people end up in the hospital after retreats, like fairly commonly, like, what? Do you want to tell us about that? So that was literally like the first interview.
Yeah, I started my kind of a formal practice in Zen community, and I remember when teachers were if there are some kind of unwanted effects, it's just the makio. It's a kind of a bad phenomena. You just ignore it and go on. And I think that in many cases, when something not so good happening with practitioners, it was just kind of the idea that it's just a makio. It's something that the ego is doing so that you can't go on with your practices, and you just, be persistent and ignore these makios, and the practice will take care of these effects. But I remember that in that community there was a crisis involved in something like 8 years there, and there was this crisis then which concerned some psychotic episodes coming from the retreats and how those were not handled properly by the teachers or the community as a whole. So it was kind of an awakening for me also about this, the other side of this meditation. I really think about so much that is it kind of caused by meditation practices. I was more concerned of this kind of a social phenomenon where the tradition is put so much value that the people who might be suffering in those traditions are not kind of heard properly. They are if not blamed from their own problems, at least it's not properly discussed and have this kind of a conversation and finding out what is really happening and how we could actually improve these practices or how we handle these cases. Yeah, so I think that there's some similarities of what you were also saying. So when did you start the research then about these adverse effects?
I think we started in 2007. I mean, it took us about 10 years to interview about 100 people. We interviewed both teachers and teachers who talked about their students and what they'd observed as teachers. And then we also interviewed 60 people who had themselves had a negative experience or a challenging experience. And 60% of those people who had their own experience ended up being teachers. So there was a lot of representation by teachers and clinicians as well.
What's behind that? What do you think?
Why were they teachers?
Yeah, so much of those people coming teachers themselves.
Well, that sort of links up to a very interesting question about risk factors. And so I think that, when we interviewed the teachers, I think all hypothesized that the people who developed, meditation related adverse effects were, maybe some of the, quote unquote, vulnerable people who had, a history of trauma, a history of psychiatric issues, various weak, psychological weaknesses. But when we got the data back and we looked at the sample characteristics, 3/4 of the sample had, graduate degrees, MDs, JDs, PhDs, and some were like CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and 60% were meditation teachers. And so it was not exactly the profile of like the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
It was like really high in people. And so that took us a while to kind of figure out like what the link was. The link is that these are people that are highly attuned to what external standards are and are very good at, and this is also, by the way, a kind of a trauma response as well. There might be overlap with that kind of thing. Just knowing, like, being able to read a classroom and a teacher and be like, okay, like this is the right answer. This is what, this is how you do it. Whenever there's a task, you do it 150%. You follow rules, you don't deviate, you don't make your own way. That has a lot of, it got all of these people, really far in life. And it's a very good, way to be. Highly conscientious is maybe another way to put it. But it's also a risk factor for meditation related problems and other problems, because if your kind of locus of control or your orientation is other people's standards and other people's values, then you end up meeting all of those values and not having a very strong internal compass of like what your own values are, what your own needs are. These people are very good at putting their own needs, at dismissing their own needs. Like they don't know when they're hungry. They don't know, like, when they need to stop. And they don't, they're not the kind of people that would ever modify their practice to meet their own needs, So these are all kinds of things that, So I think that, and then lazy people who can't seem to meditate, can't seem to get to the cushion, like they don't become meditation teachers.
Yeah. So you mentioned that this people who pay attention to other people's standards and try to achieve those, and that's a little contradictory to if you think about what these traditions usually ask to kind of go towards, in a sense, from like the other people's standards or egoistic achievements, goals, and all that. What you were saying, it kind of brought up this other side that perhaps what is kind of said and what is actually happening are two different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a chapter that in the handbook of the Oxford Handbook of Meditation team about. It's a long chapter and does a lot of things, but one of the main points is that, despite how they're marketed, religions are not person-centered. And what that means is, even though, a meditation program might market itself as like, here, come do this thing. We're going to give you this tool to like achieve what you want to do in life. It's a tool for you to do what you want. Actually, like, all the goals and values are already preset. You don't get to decide what they are. Like you don't get to go like into a Buddhist, training and sit there and, look into your mind and discover that like the true nature of being alive is to I don't know, make a lot of money or something. Like, no, that's the wrong answer. Try again. We get another choice. So, and I've actually seen, I've seen that exact example play out where that was the person's answer and they were told to go back and sit more. So this is not, I would not say universally true of all programs anymore. I think things have become more person-centered, but in general, like most places that would be considered, would associate themselves with the word dharma, ideas that are not really open for interpretation. And I think that that's one of the confusing parts about people who are just like, I just want to feel better. I just want to like, be able to be less anxious and less stressed and you have a tool for me, great, I'll do it. And they're not really asking about like, well, what's all the hidden curriculum behind that? What's all the, what are all these hidden ideas that I'm actually like, I'm consenting to kind of start imbibing into my system, because they're part of the instructions of meditation. So, just the instruction of noticing the changing sensations of the breath, noticing a thought arise and pass away. If you hear the word arise and pass away, like you are getting trained in noticing impermanence. Like that is what that is about. And like as a mindfulness teacher, which, we are told that it's a secular program, and we're told that it's not religious, we use words like arising and passing away, which is directly, teaching people the truth of impermanence, which is, a straight up, Buddhist idea, which is fine. There's no problem with teaching people that. I just think that people should know that that's what is happening. And I don't often think that that's completely transparent.
Yeah, I agree. There are lots of kind of normative things happening. So you have to adapt and, like you were saying, understand what are these social rules. Some of those are transparent, but others are not. Perhaps some socially skilled people can kind of intuit also these rules that are not so transparent there. Also this thing that you mentioned about this, that we might have in these traditions preset goals and preset right answers to those goals. It's like a teleological approach. You are not creating the path. It's already been created by somebody else, and you just have to find exactly the same path in some traditions. And one thing that I was already thinking back then, I think it was something like 2010 when this crisis in that group was happening, was this identity. What kind of identities people are building in the traditions? I was thinking then, and I'm also thinking today also, that how much this identity might affect to these adverse effects. Because I believe that the meditation practices itself can do things also, but also this identity that we are building, which might be quite normative, and it might be quite suffocating. There's a lot of idealism there, and you have to kind of put down your own needs. It's there's lots of structures that you are not aware of, and this is something that I've been also thinking about in these adverse effects of meditation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that can play out in a lot of different kinds of ways. And kind of, I mean, I'll just say that in general, I've seen the pattern of a lot of meditation related problems are in some ways like the perfect storm between the meditator's constitution and whatever tradition or practice they're engaging in. So there's not necessarily like something wrong with either one, but sometimes the combination is just like a bad match. But, in terms of sort of what types of identities can be problematic, I see that going in kind of two different directions. Sometimes, and just for the sake of sort of simplicity, those often are gendered. The first one is, which is I see a lot in sort of young males, is the superhero identity, which is that the practice is going to make you a hero, like superhuman in some way, that you're going to have, just be kind of better at you'll be better looking, you'll be better, people will love you, and there's also often a kind of a spiritual bypassing element to it, where it's like, well, I'm 22. I just graduated from college. There's a lot of pressure on me to like become someone important. I have to get a job. I have to like attract a mate. I just have to. There's so much pressure. And there's so many things to do. Like, I'm just going to get enlightened so that I don't have to deal with any of that. And like, I'll just sort of skip all that and just be on the top and just win the game of life. I mean, it's very, very vague idea, but it's amazingly attractive. And a lot of the people that come to Cheetah House are parroting that kind of model. And when I ask them, like, what exactly is enlightenment? What exactly does that look like? You know, like, let's paint the picture. Like, they don't really know. They just have been pursuing it, you know, extremely aggressively. So that's one model, the superhero model. The other model, which I would say I often see, I see it in men too, but it's more of like it seems to be attractive to people who have already been told that they don't matter, you know, which tends to be more marginalized groups. The sort of model where they're like, you need to just surrender your ego. You need to, like, any kind of advocation for yourself or your needs is just ego. And so just completely submit this other authority. And that's how you're, you know, and any kind of resistance that you feel is just your ego trying to, like, gain control. That's the other one that I see leading to a lot of problems. So I don't know your thoughts about those two, but
Yeah, those actually seem to me quite much resemble this dysfunctional family archetypes, like the hero child and the lost child. And I can remember, perhaps I was a little bit of a samurai attitude meditator myself also in those younger years. And I remember these young males coming there with this samurai attitude, you know, going through the hard rock and, you know, doing anything to get enlightened or whatever was it. And I can also recognize this other side of kind of trying to somehow become almost invisible in a world, and somehow related that to this idea of emptiness.
Yep. I mean, that was definitely my trajectory. I don't know how common this is, that you find out that the entire way that you're engaging with meditation and all of the teachers that you pick, you're just like replaying all of your family dynamics. Is that universal? I don't know. But it was definitely a theme for me. And, you know, when I was a kid, that was my role. My parents, my nickname as a kid was wantless, needless. I was like a very high achieving kid. I was on like all varsity sports, you know, I had straight A's. I was always really horrified by my brother, who had lots of desires and needs and like long Christmas list, and I would never have that. You know, I now kind of see that my method of my strategy for surviving in that family, and it sort of was that I'm going to earn my existence. I'm going to earn my membership in this family and my belonging by, you know, doing my part, but also not asking for anything. Yeah, being invisible, basically, and just trying to like be a good team member and contribute to the team, but not ask for anything. And if that's that, by the way, that's very gendered, you know, to be this sort of invisible helper kind of person. And so, yeah, it's very easy to replicate that. And I think a lot of spiritual communities are just like, you know, built to encourage that. And it also, you know, can be a very fertile ground for some seriously problematic power dynamics and abuse.
Yeah, this reminds me of this Finnish Moomin tale where there's these archetypal characters. One is this invisible ninny, young girl who is literally invisible, and they try to make her visible by addressing her needs and giving support and love, and little by little she becomes visible. That fairy tale. But there's one other archetype that I was thinking about, which is the scapegoat. in dysfunctional families. Now I was thinking about, are these the people who kind of are not doing the practices right and perhaps are having then some problems, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important piece of this whole phenomenon, this whole syndrome, is that, what happens when people report that they're having problems? Like, what's the next thing that happens? And, the first thing that happens is that they're told that it's not a problem. So there's like kind of gaslighting happening that like their perception is wrong and they need to like, dismiss their own sort of internal compass and go with the authority that says this is in fact not a problem, go back and sit, which is sometimes a learning experience. But, if that's the only answer you get, another thing. And then, if they keep coming back and saying, well, actually, like I've done what you told me, I've been doing more practice and it's getting worse. And I really can't, you're starting to interfere with my sleep and I can't function, whatever. Then there's a whole array of very predictable victim blaming that goes on. There was a one young man that came to me, this exact scenario played out on a retreat that he was on. And he kept going back to the teacher and saying like, what you're telling me is not working. This is like becoming more and more problematic. And the teacher just kind of finally just said, have you ever drank alcohol ever in your life? And he's like, well, and he was actually had been sober for the last year or so. And he was like, yeah, I mean, when I was in college, I drank alcohol. And the teacher was like, well, this is like, you've brought this problem, this meditation problem on yourself from drinking alcohol like 20 years ago. And this is your fault and you need to leave the retreat right now. So, I mean, that's a very extreme example of victim blaming, but, but there's often this move towards the problem is in the meditator. They've done something wrong. There's some kind of internal deficiency, psychiatric and trauma history, pre-existing condition. They're not meditating correctly. They don't have, a variety of different ways of doing that. And so, the problem with that, I mean, in addition to the fact that it's not very kind or compassionate, is that now the person has the primary symptoms that they had from the meditation, and now they have been abandoned by their teachers and their communities, and they feel what is called betrayal trauma. So they basically now feel betrayed by the place where they had previously become a refuge. That place that's becoming a refuge is now a source of harm. And that dynamic itself, which is also disorganized attachment, is extremely dysregulating to the nervous system, because you have this sort of this refuge seeking impulse, which is sort of the approach impulse, and then the recoiling from the harm or the aggression and the sort of running a fight or flight response happening at the same time in response to the same person or the same place, which is the same kind of dynamic that happens when you have, a parent or a caregiver who's, has a drug problem or a mental illness, where they're sometimes really caring and loving and sometimes really scary. So that can, and we know from, people, from kids who grow up in those kinds of childhoods, that really does a job on the nervous system. And so when a lot of the meditators that come to see me have a lot of those kinds of symptoms, like their nervous systems are just super dysregulated.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are lots of things that come to my mind from that. For example, this kind of a double bind, where you are basically been told that we are caring about you, we are kind of trying to help you, and at the same time there's this kind of blaming happening. Many times there can be kind of well, this reminds me of one thing that happened also in that community I mentioned before. there was this one person who was kind of supporting and trying to help these people who had some meditation-related problems. And he was questioning basically what you were also saying. If I have adverse effects, I'm kind of questioning, is this practice good for me or not? And that person was questioning the practice also and this, ways of working there. And he became very much the scapegoat. It was quite a traumatic thing also, even though he didn't have any meditation-related adverse effects itself. But this kind of this skillful means that I'm kind of behaving badly to you, but actually this is just upaya or skillful means where I'm trying to help you, kind of get rid of your ego or something like that.
So, yeah, that reminds me of something that I've come to call the snakeskin principle. And the snakeskin principle is like if you put your hand on a snake and like go from head to tail, it's very smooth. And so like as long as you're going along with the practice is good, there's no, it's perfect basically. There are no flaws. It cannot be questioned as long as you're kind of doing, the doing what you're told, everything goes well and you're loved. But as soon as you start questioning, the teacher, the dharma, the practice as not being perfect, it's like running your hand the opposite way on the snake, and suddenly things get really sharp and are not smooth anymore. And so that principle is actually, I think, a very good litmus test for when people are asking about, well, how do I still want to be part of a community. I still want to meditate. Like, how do I make sure that I'm in how do I test whether it's a safe community? Start asking critical questions and see what happens.
You have to be very brave.
If you get shut down, like, that's not a good sign. But if people are like, yeah, okay, sure. Like, yeah, that practice isn't good for everyone. You have to make it your own. There are teachers like that, and there are traditions like that say like that make room for individual differences and are also like mature in their spirituality, in that like things are not perfect and that sometimes there needs to be modifications. So I think that's a good sign.
And you have to be quite brave to ask these critical questions. But now I'm thinking about this person-centered approach you already mentioned. My own experience was also that I've been training meditators and also mindfulness teachers for something like 10 to 15 years. And I tried to develop a way of doing that so that you can kind of go with the existing strengths of the people and find the goals that you actually you want to have yourself, and not these kind of pre-made goals and practices. And I use this approach, strength-based approach that takes some elements from the family, systemic family therapy traditions, and in Finland there's this open dialogue method that's researched in the northern Finland, quite famously effective method. When I saw your person-centered approach somewhere in the internet, I was thinking about how much it resembles what I'm also being doing. Instead of just trying to squeeze people in the boxes that are pre-made somewhere, why not start from the people and what works for them and develop from there. Where did you come up with this person-centered approach? Yeah.
I didn't come up with it.
Yeah.
I think that the first exposure to it was in graduate school. I took a class in motivational interviewing, which is, kind of emblematic of what the person-centered approach is. And for anyone who's listening to this and they want to understand, there's many books by William Miller and Stephen Rolnick who invented this kind of approach. There's ones that are for clinicians and there's ones that are for, lay people. So I highly recommend following them. So that class I actually took twice because I thought it was so great. And I think part of it was, this is clinical psychology graduate school, and we're getting trained in a lot of different kinds of, and one of the other approaches that I was trained in was strategic therapy. And that was more of the idea that, you don't really tell the client what you're doing. And there's a lot of like, well, I'm the expert and I'm going to tell you to do all these things that are like counter it works. Like there's a lot of empirical data to suggest that actually empowering people to make their own decisions works better. So so that was the place that it all started. And I think I just recognized that as being like the way that I wanted to operate. And then, fast forward throughout all of my training in various groups, meditation groups on a long continuum of, secular to Buddhist, and then working with meditators in distress, a lot of these meditators would meet criteria for, religious trauma. Even if they wouldn't call it that, they are like deeply terrorized by certain kinds of ideological ideas. And so, part of the rehabilitation process is like helping them learn, maybe for the first time, or helping them regain that connection with their own internal compass, and learning like when they are kind of selling themselves out, maybe the group membership or the people pleasing, what kind of role is that playing, and just seeing that pattern unfold. But to me, it seems like the most appropriate, the most empirically supported, and the most ethical approach to people with religious trauma.
I've heard many times these kind of words that, especially in this kind of meditation communities, that you should not let yourself be the guide for the meditation, because you are not the teacher who knows the practices and the effects. How have people been receiving this kind of person-centered approach in your?
In my experience, they have been absolutely hungering for it for a long time, and not really understanding that, like, why they're so frustrated with what they've been getting, and I think that when you sort of point out that, like, oh, this was never person-centered, this was never there to support you in your life, like, that's not what this is for you. Typically the program is to like make you into, an agent of the Dharma, and do, operate and have specific goals of other that are already preset. When you actually introduce the possibility that like maybe you can create some of your own goals, and then decide from there what practice might be the best choice in order to create the goals that you choose. People are really into that. I found.
Do you have any kind of research studies or clinical experiences that are kind of supporting this kind of person-centered approach against, let's say, teacher-centered approaches?
I mean, most of the data is, within motivational interviewing. You look up on Google Scholar that the motivational interviewing data. So maybe not so much in meditation. I know that, we do have one study where we looked at the effects of the teacher, like the bond between the teacher and the student. And this wasn't necessarily like how well the teacher was, emanating enlightened qualities or directing the student, but more like how much did they share the same goals? How understood did the client feel? How warm and empathic was the teacher? So that's like sort of teacher qualities. And then there was also relationship with the other meditators in the group. And then compare that to how much they meditated and what practice they were doing. So this was all part of a dismantling trial where we were comparing the influence of practice-specific effects. So like whether concentration practice versus insight practice versus the combination. It was a 3-arm trial. And then we wanted to look at other factors to see what was predicting the best outcomes. And we actually found that the relationship with the group, so the other people in the group, was a bigger predictor than the qualities of the teacher. And both of those things were much more powerful in determining outcome than what type of meditation the person did and how much they did. That's the other thing that I think is, if psychotherapy research, such an obvious thing to ask about. We're always thinking mindfulness training, mindfulness, we call it mindfulness, or meditation has so much empirical data behind it. And it's shown to be effective. And that's how we talk, that we use the word meditation and mindfulness as the treatment. But what's actually happening in that treatment is that people are interacting with each other. We forget about that part. We're no, they're meditating all the time. But actually half the time they're actually talking to each other and sharing each other and having emotional relationships. And actually that's the part that is, at least within a clinical trial setting, that's predicting the outcomes, whether people get better or not. So I think that's a piece that we need to pay more attention to, that it might not actually be the practice so much. That I don't know if that answered your question, but there's another paper that also kind of reminds me of the importance of sort of choice and autonomy, in that this is by Norman Farb, and he looked at the choice of anchor. He gave people, I think it was the breath as a meditation anchor. I think there was a mantra choice and there was a third choice. There was a number of choices. So people ranked here are my sort of preferred anchors versus non-preferred, and then they did them. And so then they looked at what is it, the choice of anchor? Is it the anchor that matters? So is it the practice that you're given that matters, or is it the fact that you got to choose and you got your preferred anchor? So and basically the second one was what predicted the benefits. It wasn't the breath was the best anchor for everybody and that's the one you should choose, which would be more of a top-down, the teacher says kind of approach, but rather when people are given choices and then they get to choose amongst those choices what works best for them, then that was the best outcome. So I think that, this is very consistent with, there are basically 3 kind of types of approaches. One is the directive style, where the teacher's the expert, you do what you're told. You don't know because you're not, you're the unenlightened rookie and you just have to follow the directions. That's kind of a militant style where it's very hierarchical and you follow the rules and you're not advanced enough to have an opinion. So that's the directive style. The following style is the complete opposite, where the meditator is the authority and you just reflect back to them and help them understand themselves. And both of those have strengths, have weaknesses, because obviously the first one is pretty suppressing of any kind of autonomy and agency, and also is just a fertile ground for any kind of abusive relationship dynamics. And the second one is like, well, the person's coming to you for help. Like if they had all the answers inside themselves, like they would have figured it out by now. Like they might need some extra elements that they haven't thought of yet. And so, or I want to take that road. And then as the guide, I'll be like, okay, you're going to take that road. Well, let me tell you what you're going to need. You're going to need an extra pair of clothes. You're going to need a sandwich. You're going to need, this is what you're going to need on that road. But I'll come with you on that road. So that's more of like what the motivational interviewing or the person-centered approach is like. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what we were discussing about these roles that you might have in this tradition, like this resembling the roles in a family, especially in the dysfunctional family. You have these certain roles that you are kind of you could almost say that the kind of the structure of the family is putting people in different roles. And it seems to happen also in meditation groups and other groups, of course, especially if there are some kind of dysfunctional elements there. It's quite easy to see that these kind of patterns start to emerge and play out in these kind of groups. And then I was thinking about this family therapy and the motivational interview. I also have been trained in that, how much it matters in this kind, especially family systems, that you have autonomy and agency, like you were saying. Those are very important factors in repairing the relationships and how it works, the patterns of the families. And in this open dialogue approach that is used in some psychiatric hospitals in Finland, there's one thing that it's very different from other psychiatric hospitals. It is that they don't treat the people, for example, with schizophrenia, without they be involved in the decisions that they make. And they also ask their family relatives to come there in the sessions and discuss with the patient, the relatives, the doctors, and nurses. And they all decide together what is happening. Not so that some expert in some room there decides what is done to you because you are patient and you have schizophrenia, so you don't know what to do and what you should do. But they are kind of flip that the other way. It works very well. Many hospitals and countries around the world are kind of studying what they are doing in those hospitals. So I think that if we don't blindly just think about meditation as a kind of a practice that is very different from other kind of things that people are doing, but we are more kind of looking at it in a social level. It's something that social groups are doing. And what is emerging there, it's quite easy to see that you mentioned how your relationship with the peers, what kind of alliance you have with the teacher and those things. Of course, those things matter more than just the thing that you are doing in that so-called practice. For example, following you. So what do you think?
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one of the first ones is just, I'm just so curious about Finland. As you, I'm sure, have been reminded that Finland, once again won the most happy country thing. And it's just, there's a lot of attention what you guys are doing right, which I think is a lot of things better than us, the US. I want to ask you the question about, what is it like to be there, and what do you think? I mean, the Finns didn't invent the person-centered approach, but obviously, people are following their lead on certain things. I don't know if you have any thoughts about.
Yeah, well, if you ask any Finn about this most happiest country thing, everyone will say, how is that possible? I think the good thing is that in many cases, we do have these kind of structures that I was telling about in this open dialogue also are getting lots of, at least lot of choices in the society. We don't have very much like a private schools or something that will become more elitistic, more kind of a bubbles that there are lots of rich people in some other parts of the society. And there are those things also here, but perhaps not so much like that in US, for example. But I don't know. That's something that comes to my mind.
Do you think that plays out in the way that meditation is taught?
In Finland?
I mean, I'll just say that I think that our entire, I'm not sure about other countries, but in the US, it seems like, the capitalistic, individualistic, kind of Darwinian American way, it has also made its way into meditation. Notice this, I've been teaching at Brown University for almost 20 years. And so I've also noticed this getting worse and worse and worse within the students, and just this paralyzing pressure to be special and to be awesome, to be just like over the top awesome, the sort of competitive pressure. So there's a way to, this is kind of like the superhero, thing where like the meditation is going to make me sort of give me a competitive edge. And then there's also the other possibility, which is kind of, again, my own arc of my trajectory, which was my practice eventually kind of eroded and that I'm, just much more kind of accepting with how I am, and I'm not going to try to be awesome on every front because it's exhausting and stressful. And so, yeah, I don't know if you think that the social system of Finland, it's different than that.
This reminds me, when we had this problem in that community I mentioned, I wrote a blog post afterwards. There had been many things happening. The title of that blog post in Finnish was Meditation and the Art of Being a Scandinavian. And my point was, I guess, that where these meditation groups or community was led was very much, I think, coming from the Eastern American cultures. People were not they were not treated like we should be treating each other in northern countries, in the northern welfare state. And this is something that I was kind of insight of mine that, wait a minute, what is happening in that community is something that we would never allow in our northern welfare state. We are kind of, the community had took culture from a little bit militant Japanese culture, and then this American culture where it came from also. So I think that in these meditation groups that we have in Finland, they are led mostly, they are trying to kind of resemble the culture where they are coming. Buddhist groups are, Buddhist culture, and yoga groups try to have some kind of Indian culture or something like that. I don't know how many groups there are that are kind of designed by our own culture. I think that our group that we have been kind of developing during these 15 years is more like that, but it's important mostly, I think.
I mean, it also strikes me as kind of a paradox. And we have been paying so much attention to cultural sensitivity and, medicine and psychotherapy. And we have this entire field now of, cultural psychology and cultural medicine. And a lot of that was based on making sure that Western ideals were not imposed on other countries, and that we needed to be much more sensitive to the way that they understand, well-being and illness and the ways that those things can manifest, and to not, impose our ideas of those. But what's so ironic is that, within the meditation culture, if we were going to apply the sort of principle that like you should always honor a culture's sort of native ideas, right? And that like when a new treatment or modality or technology comes from another place, it should always be incorporated within the culture's already established values, right? So that's the sort of principle that we're talking about. But in the case of meditation, often we've basically allowed there to be this sort of reverse imperialism where like now the like values of the original, I clearly have never articulated this idea before because I'm struggling to articulate it, but we're basically taking on we're not standing up for our own values within meditation cultures, like that we're allowing those ideas to be imposed on us and not saying like, actually we believe in individualism, actually we believe in like not having the teacher have all the answers and submitting to authority, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's my experience also, that especially it's a very traditional tradition in a sense that it tries to kind of follow the idealistic form of that tradition. It seems that people are willing to let go of the kind of their own values and culture and adapt to that one. And they will also say, you have to let go of that individualistic Western idea because it doesn't work with these practices. But then there are some other groups. I know that like in the US there is this Springwater Center that was established by late Tony Packer, where they actually tried to incorporate this kind of a Krishnamurtian free practice, no authorities, no hierarchies, and it's running there. So I guess there are some groups everywhere that are also trying to develop this more the practices or the kind of things that are more aligned with our own value systems and what works with us.
Mm-hmm.
We are, I guess, coming to an end of this podcast, but I still want to ask you a little bit about this person-centered approach. What would you like to say, people listening to this and perhaps struggling with their own practices or trying to decide whether these meditation practices would be a good fit for me or not?
Well, at the risk of doing shameless self-promotion, I did create something called My Map, which is my meditation assessment process. And it's just something that reflects a conversation that I've had over and over and over again with people, like trying to reorient their meditation practice in a person-centered way. And it's basically just an Excel sheet. So you can get it at the Cheetah House website. It's on the online courses tab. I'm actually having a follow-up workshop today for people who fill it out. Basically, the idea is you write down all the reasons why you want to meditate, like what kinds of functions you hope that it will fulfill. Like maybe it will help calm your mind. It'll give you, a more comprehensive worldview of, what we're doing here, life and death. Maybe it will give you a community. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people meditate, and it's really good to articulate that to ourselves, at least, to know like what we wanted. And also those can change over time. And so when I first started meditating at age 20, I was really attracted to the sort of like comprehensive worldview approach. Like I didn't have a comprehensive worldview. I was 20 and was kind of lost. And I liked that everything sort of fit together in this perfect way. And that was a very important thing for me. And following Dharma teachers for 2 decades, like helped with that. But if you go through this process, like the practices that I did, like I said, I was a wisdom junkie. So I kind of overtrained in a lot of the wisdom approaches. I did a lot of noting. I did a lot of concentration, and I was pretty weak on the compassion side of things and the relational side of things. And so as I'm mapping out my practice, like I needed to be updated to reflect like what I'd already done and like the strengths that I'd already built. And then also to see like, okay, what do I need to do now? To me, that this isn't like a periodic thing that like should happen in everybody's approach, which is like, okay, how's it going? First of all, just like there should be, I think, an approach. People should clarify their values before they start. Like, what are you after? What do you want out of this? Like, what would your life look like? Like really get into detail. Like, what would your life look like if you got what you wanted? And if that's enlightenment, like great, just write that down, what that's going to look like very specifically. Like, what kind of emotions do you have? Are you missing emotions that you used to have? Do you have new emotions that you didn't have? Or do you have no emotions at all? Like, how many thoughts do you have? Do you have less thoughts? Do you have different thoughts? Like, how does your body feel? What do you look like? Who's around you? How are they relating to you? Like all of that, like play it out. Write a little, like do a creative writing exercise about like, I'm enlightened now and this is what my life looks like. So you can really see like what kind of hopes and projections you're putting onto that idea and like really get it out there. And then I think once you kind of get a sense of like what you want, then it makes it much easier to start choosing practices that might be practices and teachers and systems that might be a better fit for your goals. And again, like to reiterate what I said before, a lot of the problems that I'm seeing are just simply mismatches between the person and the practice that they chose. And so many people just end up practicing whatever practice was best advertised to them. I'm like literally like people are like, oh, I'm going to learn to meditate, like go to the Apple store, press meditation, and like, you either get Calm or Headspace because they have the most money to do the advertising to get their app to the top of the list. And that's how it's decided for you what meditation you choose. That should not be the way that you choose your meditation practice. Your meditation practice is like, I would say it's up there with choosing a life partner. It's kind of like an intimate thing. And so it shouldn't be market forces that are deciding what practice you do. Like you should be a very deliberate, conscious process. And also one where like you should be a high demanding consumer, and that like if it's not meeting your goals, like trade it out for another one. I mean, I don't want to like create just like a, super high demand, high maintenance people that are just like, I'm not enlightened after 24 hours, like give me the next thing. Like obviously like this is hard work, and there's going to be a lot of commitment on the part of the meditator too. But I've also seen people that like have just continued to engage in a practice that was harming them for decades, and like just continued it to well, at some point it's going to turn around, and it's like, well, how much of your life do you want to like donate to that cause if you're wrong? So I think that, yeah, this other process is a way of turning it around and being like, is your meditation practice serving you, or are you serving your meditation practice? And like, these are, kind of meta-ethical questions about like, those are both legitimate ways of practicing, but you have to make a choice as to which one that you want to choose. And I personally am promoting, the first one, that the meditation practice is a tool and it should be serving you. And then how do you engage with that? So the clarifying your goals, and then also re-clarifying your goals and whether your practice is meeting them and whether it might need to be adapted or modified. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Willoughby, of this conversation. This was very much fun. Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks a lot, Ari.
Tämä oli mielen laboratorio. Jos olet kiinnostunut jungilaisesta coachauksesta, lyhyt psykoterapeuttisesta työskentelystä tai työnohjauksesta esimerkiksi meditaation liittyen, ota yhteyttä lähettämällä sähköpostia osoitteeseen ap@mielenlaboratorio.fi. Tutustu myös kirjoihini Mielen laboratorio sekä Mindfulness, mielen selkeys ja myötätunto, joka löytyy nyt myös äänikirjana. Ja jos pidit jaksosta, jaa se myös ystävillesi, jotta hekin pääsevät syventymään oman mielensä labyrintteihin.